Hey, Cypher here. The recent Napoleon movie was painful, but I've finally gotten around to reviewing it. Director Ridley Scott seems to be really hit or miss. I liked The Last Duel. This time, on the other hand, is just a failure, a ridiculously botched opportunity. Napoleon himself is one of the most influential people ever, and possibly the most influential person in modern history. It should be extraordinarily easy to make a compelling story about him. In fact, there's too much to talk about him, which may be the movie's ultimate blunder, rendering it a disorganized mess without enough compelling plot to drag the reluctant viewer along. In order to understand that, let's briefly cover Napoleon's biography, for truth is so much more fascinating than what artistic license could ever replace. Thanks to my patrons on Patreon and Aura for sponsoring this episode. They are a digital protection company that monitors your accounts and further secures them. Napoleon himself could have used better secrecy. After all, his downfall largely came from leaks that he'd made special exceptions to the continental system he created, leading to Russia refusing to take part and the failed invasion that ensured so many allies would come to defeat him at Leipzig. So much misery can come from lacking privacy, yet so many places that store your personal data get leaked. Then that data makes its way into spam and scam directories. I know I've certainly had that happen a few times. Aura has an all-encompassing set of tools for determining what breaches have happened, capturing that data, removing as much as possible, advising when you need to change accounts or passwords, and securing everything, including their own credit monitoring, virtual private network, and antivirus. By checking out Aura, you don't have to make Napoleon's mistake. You can get a 14-day free trial with aura.com/cynicalhistorian, which will allow you to see if any of your data has been exposed. That's aura.com/cynicalhistorian for a free 14-day trial. Thanks to Aura for sponsoring, and on with the show. The Bonapartes were a Corsican family dating back to the 15th century, being from the Italian peninsula before that, hence why they'd go by Bonaparte until 1796. They were fairly minor, even for a minor island. Corsica was always a fractious place, so Genoa sold it to France in 1764, and France promptly invaded 4 years later, exiling Pasquale Paoli, who had ruled as a president of a proclaimed independent republic since 1755. Napoleon was born just after the invasion concluded in 1769 to a father who had sided with the French, becoming part of the newly created gentry. Napoleon himself resented French authority, but benefited from their patronage. He went to a few academies to learn the language and acculturate, since he grew up speaking Italian and ended up in the military, despite despising Louis XVI, becoming an officer in the rapidly advancing artillery. As a youth, he showed aptitude in poetry and philosophy, but the army drove him toward functional inquiries. Before he could do much of anything, though, the French Revolution broke out, making it difficult for him to provide for his family as the sole breadwinner out of 5 brothers. Given his hatred for the monarchy, Napoleon easily fit in with the Jacobins. Both he and his brother, Joseph, sided with Maximilien Robespierre. Returning to Corsica, they got involved in the fractiousness of Paoli's return. Napoleon went on a farcical expedition to Sardinia before returning to the mainland as an artillery officer. The ranks had thinned thanks to the revolution and awaited his rise. He knew how to wield cannons, but had yet to test his mettle. The centralization of power during the Terror created a series of revolts. In Toulon, Napoleon helped plan a crucial seizure of the heights with artillery, earning him easy promotion. Only a year later, Robespierre fell victim to his own terror. The Bonapartes were imperiled by this change of affairs, but slipped the guillotine. During the unrest of the following couple of years, he might have used grapeshot to halt a mob in Paris. During a brief period between military appointments, Napoleon married Josephine de Beauharnais. She took his proposal largely to pay her own debts, and even cheated on him regularly at first. He'd take a series of mistresses, but only after learning of her liaison. So Napoleon, indisputably one of the most important men in history, was a cuckold. Before he could find out, though, he took command of a campaign in Italy during the War of the First Coalition, only a few days after his wedding, in fact. French troops were undersupplied and Napoleon had yet to prove himself as a capable general. Yet, he quickly had Austria on the run, using his signature move of enveloping an enemy through rapid and pre-planned maneuvering. The army pushed deep into German territory before Emperor Francis sued for peace. It was a magnificent victory. On top of that, as part of a peace agreement, he captured Venice and ended their more than 1,000-year-old republic. Britain remained belligerent. France couldn't adequately challenge their navy, but Napoleon hatched a crazy plan to hinder their commerce by conquering some key trading points. He led the capture of Malta and then invaded Egypt with a force of 40,000. Included among them were scientists and scholars who would make numerous breakthroughs, such as discovering the Rosetta Stone and document much of the ancient ruins throughout the area. Napoleon himself played up the part of an enlightened ruler, here to liberate the once great kingdom from Mamluk tyranny. This was placating the local populace with cultural relativism. When ruling captured territory, he revealed a key factor that made his command so strident and powerful. He was a meticulous micromanager. His Armée d'Orient made an arduous journey from Alexandria to Cairo. Despite the wanton calamity of that movement, he proved that he could push his soldiers to move far more rapidly than most generals, which was repeatedly useful throughout his career. They readily conquered Egypt, putting down a nasty revolt with severe brutality. The British Navy managed to find France's ships, and despite the British being outnumbered, readily defeated the far worse performing French, and thereby obliterating Napoleon's connection to Europe. So he embarked on an ill-fated attack up into Ottoman Syria, which includes today's Palestine, Israel, and Lebanon. He had some vain hope of going from there all the way to India, as though he were Alexander the Great, and stabbing at the British Empire in her most important colony. The march weakened them tremendously, and when they successfully besieged Jaffa, Napoleon ordered more than a couple thousand prisoners massacred, guaranteeing stiff resistance everywhere they went. Hence why he couldn't break the defense of Acre a couple weeks later. The army returned to Egypt in failure, though they defeated an Ottoman invasion at Abukir. Napoleon returned to France before his commanders even knew it, selfishly abandoning Egypt and his own men, though France would remain in control for a couple of very rebellious years. The Directory that had ruled the French Republic since 1795 had lost public confidence. Intrigue after intrigue threatened their power, and one was bound to succeed. A second coalition formed against France, and the economy was faring poorly in 1799. Several key players were organizing a coup, and the Bonapartes took part. Bonapartes took part. It was basically bloodless, involving many machinations about suppressing a coup and granting emergency powers to the plotters. When they dissolved the Council of 500, supposedly some of the council pulled daggers, allowing the grenadiers to ensure their compliance, while Lucien Bonaparte theatrically pledged that he would plunge a knife into his brother if he ever proved to become a tyrant. 3 consuls ruled France, with Napoleon as the most important of them. Soon Napoleon consolidated power under a new constitution, passed in a rigged plebiscite. This government had the semblance of checks and balances, but largely centered control on the first consul. Almost immediately, people attempted to assassinate him. Throughout his rule, there would be dozens of plots, some that came very near fruition. Using this as reasoning, the consulate passed extreme restrictions on publications and speech. Censorship was commonplace everywhere else, but quite the violation of revolutionary principles. Nonetheless, British newspapers and magazines readily filtered into French society, always lampooning Napoleon in ways he consistently took umbrage with. Throughout all of this, France still had to defeat the Second Coalition. In a daring move, Napoleon marched 40,000 troops through the Alps, a feat unknown since the time of Charlemagne. They were halted at a fort, but pressed on into Italy. Napoleon proved adept at predicting the enemy's movements and pre-planning a pincer formation to envelop them, which he did at the decisive Battle of Marengo, forcing the Austrians from Italy altogether. Even Britain signed a peace in 1802 at Amiens that lasted for 2 years, securing Napoleon's power as first consul. His war plans weren't all successes, though. He sent an army to take back Haiti, which failed miserably. They resorted to horrendous atrocities, including using barges with burning sulfur to massacre prisoners, essentially the first gas chambers. Napoleon ordered the reinstatement of slavery after a decade of abolition. Nonetheless, once his hopes for another New World empire were fully dashed, he sold the Louisiana Territory for a pittance to the United States, partially as recompense after he'd forced the conclusion of a brief war between both republics at the beginning of his consulship. France had only gained the territory back from Spain in an exchange 3 years prior, and was kind of a violation of that agreement. More successful were the sister republics France had created throughout the 1790s. Most were client states. In an effort to appease conservative forces during the early consular years, Napoleon gave back the Papal States to Pope Pius VII in 1800, and a year later came to a concordat to reinstate Catholicism in France. The following year, national representatives voted to make Napoleon consul for life, and a plebiscite confirmed it, making France essentially a republic in name only. Almost in reaction, Britain declared war in 1803, but not much came of that at first. He had appointed 4 jurists and himself to create a series of civil laws that were more effective and able to be duplicated elsewhere, combining many historical codes and reworking everything they could into something cohesive. That was complete by 1801, but went unpublished until 1804. The Napoleonic Code became the blueprint for civil codes all over Europe, and eventually the rest of the world, though Napoleon always showed a fascinating amount of flexibility to support local customs. In May of 1804, the Senate granted him the title Emperor of France. He'd continued to claim republicanism, but the definition of republic is that it is not a monarchy. He consolidated a number of sister republics as kingdoms under his control, placing much of his family on various thrones throughout the empire. Starting immediately, he began ennobling people with feudal titles, recreating kind of an aristocracy, which he would formalize in 1808 after much experimentation. Finally, he reorganized the French military, creating the Grande Armée, which used his new corps system. This new type of division was effectively an entire army within an army, with all the types of units necessary to be self-sufficient, yet under a larger command. Each corps comprising around 40 to 80,000 soldiers. These corps would have several generals, and be led by a baton-wielding Marshal. Elite troops would be placed in the Imperial Guard, which eventually comprised Napoleon's reserve troops, grouped by their level of experience, hence the name Young, Middle, and Old Guards. This is largely how armies would organize until World War I, and is still an essential part of military organization today. European powers quickly took umbrage with this upstart Corsican declaring himself an emperor, so they formed another coalition against him. He rode out in 1805 to face them with this new Grande Armée, and a few allied countries as well. The corps system was extremely effective, granting Napoleon his greatest battlefield victory at Austerlitz, allowing him to dictate the terms of peace with relative impunity. His navy was different, because Britain handed them an extreme defeat at the Cape of Trafalgar, which attained Royal Navy dominance over the world's oceans until the United States supplanted that during World War II. Britain used this to blockade the continent and remain free of the Grande Armée's overwhelming might. Nonetheless, Napoleon had made enough gains to create the Confederation of the Rhine, essentially the first step toward uniting Germany and substantially inciting nationalism everywhere after Romanticism created the intellectual circumstances for it. This victory inevitably led to another coalition war against Napoleon 3 months later. Yet again, Napoleon brought out the Grand Armée and trounced the opposition, pushing it all the way to Prussia's capital of Berlin in less than a month, and marching further into former Poland before Sweden and Russia surrendered in July of 1807. While those two were worthy adversaries, Napoleon chose to punish Prussia by tremendously reducing her territory, something that would come back to bite him, since the very militaristic country would remain embittered. On a river near Tilsit, he met with Tsar Alexander I to hammer out an agreement. They became the best of friends there, seemingly a bromance that could last forever, even reaffirming it in Erfurt a year later. All of this maneuvering created a response to Britain's naval hegemony, the continental system. Essentially, French allies were supposed to block all trade with Britain. The UK economy being driven by international merchants, the idea was that cutting them off would cripple that. Land versus water. How could terra firma, the unsinkable blockade, lose? Trying to enforce the continental system was actually the source of Napoleon's ultimate defeat. At his triumphant peak, he had sowed the seed of his own destruction. Troubles involving the continental system began almost immediately. Sweden refused and Russia attacked them for it. Closer to home, Portugal also refused. France, in coordination with Spain, invaded and occupied the entire country, though the Portuguese king and his entourage managed to escape. French troops also took several Spanish fortresses, which caused many problems for Spaniards, leading to a mutiny and the abdication of Charles IV for his son. But then he contested that. France summoned the famously dysfunctional Spanish family to Bayonne to supposedly hammer out an agreement. Instead, Napoleon put his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. 3 days prior, on the 2nd of May 1808, Spain arose in popular revolt. France easily defeated the Spanish military, but a guerrilla war developed instead. It became an intractable conflict that Joseph and Napoleon could not solve, despite resorting to executions in response to guerrilla brutality. Britain took the opportunity to support the rebellion. Starting from Lisbon, the entire Iberian Peninsula remained in a state of warfare for half a decade, pushing and pulling in fits and starts, with rebel chiefs picking at the sides. This showed France was weak, so yet another coalition formed against her, using the continental system as their excuse to fight. The War of the Fifth Coalition was easy to defeat. The Allies lasted for a mere 6 months against France. But the Peninsular War continued. The British remained belligerent, and the continental system was somewhat secure. Now, Napoleon simply needed to secure his dynasty. Josephine couldn't produce an heir due to complications from her previous marriage, so he divorced her and sought a new empress, which he found in the recently defeated Austrian Empire, now forced into an alliance. He married Emperor Francis's daughter, Marie-Louise. They produced a boy who would only live to be 21 and no other heirs. This marriage might have angered Tsar Alexander, whose sisters had been contemplated and even approached, but that doesn't explain Alexander's next move. France started granting certain exemptions to the continental system, obviously favoring themselves in order to make a profit. Louis Bonaparte, who had been made King of Holland, used this to basically ignore the entire system, leading to Napoleon deposing him and annexing Holland. Russia also started ignoring the system, despite the Erfurt Agreement, which led to another war. Napoleon gathered an alliance and invaded Russia in June 1812. They pushed further and further, trying to have a decisive battle that would end the war. This was not the rapid march of his previous campaigns. He rode in a carriage most of the way, and his marshals and generals brought their own luxuries along as well. Russians scorched the earth behind them as they retreated deeper and deeper ahead of the French. Once they reached Smolensk in August, that seemed like a perfect halt before winter set in, especially after a horrifically costly battle at Borodino could have made Napoleon retreat back. Instead, he kept on in the hope that a decisive battle for Moscow would end the war. He reached that city only after it had been evacuated. Arsonists set it ablaze instead. There was still time to return to Smolensk, but Napoleon decided to stay in Moscow for too long, beginning a retreat just as a very bitter winter set in. Since Russia had destroyed so much, forage was meager and the Grande Armée was ill-prepared for just how bad the cold would be. Truly dreadful conditions led to soldiers eating their horses and in some cases even each other, while Russians marched parallel to the retreat, inflicting even more casualties with quick raids on France's beleaguered troops. By the time the invasion returned in late 1812, over 800,000 casualties from both sides littered the 1,000-kilometer path they had taken. It was a disaster, and everyone could tell Napoleon's regime was living on borrowed time. Later in life, Napoleon would argue that the best time for him to have been killed in combat was at Borodino. He had to flee ahead of his army to secure Paris from open intrigues, though his soldiers interpreted this as another abandonment like in Egypt. Within weeks of his return, British General Wellington was making strides in Spain, pushing France back. Napoleon would depose his brother in favor of Ferdinand VII, hoping to appease Spaniards and halt the Peninsular War, but Wellington kept pushing onwards, eventually taking Spain back. Before that, a sixth coalition had formed and Napoleon mustered a meager army to meet it. Initially, he had some success, despite having very little cavalry. Clemens von Metternich called a truce at Plaswitz, which was just long enough for the Allies to regroup and prepare for a serious battle. At Leipzig, the Allies decisively defeated Napoleon in the largest European battle prior to World War I. In his disorganized retreat, he did manage to make a few victories, so Metternich proposed a peace with France, keeping her natural borders. Even though Napoleon agreed to it, Britain did not, so the war continued as the French line collapsed. They mounted a desperate defense, but after the failure of Russia, the citizenry weren't willing to volunteer anymore, especially once one of Napoleon's marshals surrendered an entire corps, leading to his abdication after Paris fell. That night, he attempted suicide, but failed. The Bourbons were once again in charge of France, while the Allies, led by Metternich, met in Vienna to decide how to rule Europe after so many years of warfare. Napoleon went into exile, ruling the small island of Elba. He still had a retinue, small military and title, but it was a purposeful insult. He kept track of the public sentiment, and clearly French people were dissatisfied with the possibility of Louis XVIII bringing back feudalism. So one night, Napoleon boarded a small flotilla and sailed to France. He faced no resistance on the way to Paris, even having some soldiers switch loyalties for him, though they could have easily defeated him right there. Louis fled and Napoleon bloodlessly took back France in 1815. This was a period known as the 100 Days. Of course, the European powers joined in one last coalition to defeat him. The Congress at Vienna had basically decided the fate of peace, but now they needed to secure it against Napoleon. Yet France was ready and willing to sign up this time, save for another uprising in the Vendée. Napoleon tried to halt the Allies from coming together by defeating some Prussians and turning against Wellington at Waterloo. But he made some key mistakes at this battle in not attacking with full enough force, which allowed the Prussians to regroup and surprise him, losing the battle. It was a general rout, and Napoleon tried to flee France altogether. He hoped to take some ships to New York and live in America, but a British blockade stopped him. So Britain sent him to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he would live out the rest of his years in a little mansion away from the rest of the population, with a tiny retinue to keep him company. He had some petty fights with his keepers, but most of his time was spent in luxury and writing two works, a biography of Caesar and a memoir that became the best-selling book of the 19th century after the Bible. He was sickly much of the time and died in 1821. Napoleon's brief 51 years changed Europe forever in ways that are difficult to quantify. Using this legacy in 1848, his nephew took power in France, naming himself Napoleon III. Karl Marx would memorably write of this. Hegel says somewhere that great historic facts and personages recur twice. He forgot to add, once as tragedy and again as farce. While this new incarnation inspired hope of a Bonapartist revival, it ultimately failed when Prussia trounced France in 1871. There's still holdouts of Bonapartism today, but Napoleon's real legacy is his civil code, military brilliance, and the creation of a new age that still affects us today. Because of his influence, there is an insane amount of history written about him. According to one historian, more books have been written with Napoleon in the title than there have been days since his death in 1821. So I'm simply trying to synthesize what I've read. There's a ton of stuff to pull from, yet the director of this film, Ridley Scott, seemed to avoid all of that. The historical advisor for this was the same as The Last Duel, largely to research questions for Scott, but he appears to have been basically ignored. They did bring on historian Michael Breuers for pre-production, but did not do anything more. They also brought in Paul Bittis to drill actors, and somehow apparently he became involved in maintaining accuracy. Despite his sole qualification being a military veteran, Bittis made some dumb comments trying to defend the obvious errors in the film from critics, and so he's gotten a lot of scrutiny as a result. If being a veteran is your sole qualification, then why the heck did I go out and get a PhD? I was apparently already qualified before becoming a history major. The problems all seem to come down to Scott, though, who just seems to have been the wrong director for this project altogether. He's told critics to get a life, and denied history by telling historians, "Were you there? Oh, you weren't there? Then how do you know?" That kind of solipsism is so moronic that it literally denies the entire existence of history as a whole. Listen well, Ridley. If you can't handle the heat, step out of the fire. Historians are going to roast you. You tried to play our game. But when you get beaten, all you can say is, "Screw you guys, I'm going home."
Hey, I don't want to be Jesus anymore. Don't leave me here, you guys. All right, that does it. Screw you guys, I'm going home.
Get good, bruh. Your paltry attempt at history pales in comparison to the other great history films from that very same year. And all you can do is whine about the mean old historians? Face it, your movie deserves ridicule. Seriously, how does someone that ignorant get any historical production greenlit? The oddly anti-French slant of this film is also explained when Scott retorted, "The French don't even like themselves." Suffice it to say, the director didn't want to tell a good story. Instead, he seems to have just wanted to tell a love story with cool battles. But, oh boy did he fail at that. Contempt for your subject matter is a recipe for disaster. What's even more disappointing is the fact that this movie did not need to be made. There have already been so many depictions of Napoleon. One key thing most get correct is that they only take a piece of Napoleon's life, rather than trying to do a cradle-to-grave story. That's a key mistake Scott made here, guaranteeing some horrendous omissions and strange scrambling over time. Even so, that could be mitigated with appreciation for the topic, which is clearly not present here. And this isn't an isolated issue. A bad version will make similar movies less likely to get greenlit. I was honestly excited for this project, especially when Last Duel was so good. Are you excited for the new Napoleon movie? I am. Well, it looks like fun, and I definitely plan to review it once I can. Now it's likely that such a grand epic won't be made for a few years. Before I tear into just how much of a disservice this movie is, let's get what little praise I've got for the movie out of the way. First of all, the costuming and set design in this is really good. Even good historical movies tend to turn the past into some drab nightmare. Not only does the crew get the diversity of uniforms and whatnot correct, but they made certain scenes resemble famous paintings. Like here's the Gérôme painting of the Sphinx. Or here's Jacques-Louis David's painting of Napoleon's coronation. With all his decades of directing, Scott certainly knows how to frame a shot. Though, why is the Treaty of Tilsit not on a boat? The first was very famously on a boat, in the middle of the Niemen River. Missed opportunity there. I really like the scene where everyone is trying to arrest Robespierre and how he failed to accurately shoot himself before capture. Napoleon's command of Toulon is quite well done too, though they screwed up the timeline a bit by having Robespierre's downfall after this, when it happened before, rendering the plot there mangled as heck. Also, this line perfectly describes Napoleon's character.
Your mistaken ambition has ever been, and will continue to be, the guide of all your actions.
So that's cool, but does nothing when the movie goes out of its way to deny this very obvious characterization. Much of Napoleon and Josephine's relationship is correctly shown, which includes their infidelity. There's little problems, such as having Josephine calling herself that from the beginning.
Son of Josephine Beauharnais.
Oddly enough, Napoleon actually forced her to start calling herself that instead of Rose, as she had done before. Napoleon had a strange admiration for his older brother, Joseph, which is likely why he had Rose change her typical name. Or how the movie insinuates Josephine was instantly infatuated with her paramour during the wedding. No, that happened because he immediately left for Italy, not Egypt like is shown. It took time for that affair to develop, but why they divorced and how Napoleon stayed affectionate to Josephine is true. One part of this movie that stands out extremely well is when Napoleon is in Moscow. It shows the Emperor's bitter disappointment of finding an empty city. They address the likelihood that Russians set the city ablaze and the need to return.
Who did this?
They did.
If we go back to Poland, we can wait out the winter months.
Finally, the misery of the retreat is actually relevant to the story. Unfortunately, Scott simply skips from that to the Treaty of Fontainebleau. That is a real letdown, right after such a great sequence. Everything good about this comes with caveats, and there just isn't much praise to be had. This movie is all over the place. Cradle-to-grave stories almost never work, and this is no different. First, let's address the omissions. Just to list off the wars that Napoleon fought and are not depicted are the Italian campaign, taking Malta, Syria campaign, Haiti, War of the 4th, 5th, and 6th coalitions, and the Peninsular War. Skipping stuff is necessary, but some of these are simply painful and kinda ruin the story. Like, there's the literal first scene, where they have this text talking about the beginning of the revolution, and suddenly jump to Marie Antoinette's beheading, 4 years later. This forces a really dumb impression on the viewer, as though the revolution immediately fell to terror, and that Napoleon was the one to save it. That's really bad. Furthermore, Napoleon was not at the execution, nor was he disgusted with it. If anything, he was quite happy with it, hence his alliance with Robespierre. In fact, they even portray the end of the terror like it's this massive prisoner escape, which yet again is hilariously dumb. Historians argue about when the terror even ended, especially since executions continued. Then they have Napoleon at a survivor's ball afterward, when he was actually aligned with the Jacobins and therefore was certainly not invited to such societies, which in any case were not held until at least a year after Robespierre's downfall. And I really can't believe they skipped the 6th Coalition, which included the Battle of Nations near Leipzig, literally the biggest European battle before World War I. What a thing to miss! There's absolutely no mentions of the various kingdoms Napoleon created, the difference between various coalitions against him, nor anything about Spain. Wellington just shows up in this movie out of nowhere in Vienna and acts like he hates Napoleon, despite so much evidence to the contrary.
The only regret we all share is that we allowed this vermin to live at all.
Wellington actually respected the Emperor quite a bit, and he wasn't just some stuffed-up aristocrat, given the guerrilla war he fought for years in Iberia.
I never get wet if I can help it.
Scum of the earth, Nan. What damn fine fellows we have made of them, sir. Quite.
That omission renders this scene laughably bad. During that speech, it shows Tsar Alexander of Russia and says Prussia.
120,000 troops from Prussia.
I have no idea how they screwed that up, but they clearly show Prussian flags and refer to Marshal Blücher, so this just seems to be poor blocking. In either case, Russia and Prussia are two different countries. One of the main issues with this film is that it tries to fit all of Napoleon's ascension after Toulon as motivated by his desire for Josephine. That's why they made him go to that ball where he didn't belong, to meet Josephine. He returns from Egypt when her philandering gets revealed.
I'm returning home.
This will be seen as desertion.
When in reality, he began a retributive affair himself. And while we're talking about Egypt, what the heck is this tunnel thing under the pyramid? What? Seriously, how do you get that wrong? We'll get into the other thing about the pyramids later. Then so much happens that the movie cannot fit within the love story, so it just feels disjointed and rudderless. Even the parts that involve Josephine, like the coronation and marriage to Marie-Louise, have to be awkwardly shoved into this Josephine plotline. Because of this discombobulation, we get this golden line.
You think you're so great because you have boats!
Ooh! That's funny as heck. We don't really understand the continental system in this, so it comes off as just deranged. When that happens, I had to pause it because I was laughing so much.
You think you're so great because you have boats! You have boats! 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 I'm on a boat!
Then there's the 100 Days, where Scott forces the Josephine relationship beyond the confines of time and space.
Come quickly, my friend.
The movie has Josephine live long enough to draw Napoleon back, and her death makes him unmotivated for the War of the Seventh Coalition. This is very obviously incorrect. They tried to fix the plot hole by acting like he wasn't told, even though he actually was.
And no one thought to notify me.
He learned of her death fairly quickly and even shut himself in a room for 2 days in Elba. Instead, the Josephine plot fizzles out and makes the whole movie fall apart. So the story sucks, but at least the battles are cool, right? Heck no. Now, I'm not one for getting into the specifics of strategy and tactics. Honestly, a bunch of moving lines on maps makes for incredibly boring history. Nonetheless, I've got to point out some of the major inaccuracies. Scott chose to show Napoleon shooting the pyramids. Obviously, that never happened. Last time I checked, the pyramids of Giza have no cannonball holes in them. Scott says it's supposed to be symbolic of the entire campaign, but no. It's just stupid explosions for the sake of explosions, like the director suddenly got possessed by Michael Bay.
When it comes to blowing up, no director is my equal!
Even for visual spectacle, it makes no sense. Then there's the abysmal depiction of Napoleon's greatest victory, the Battle of Austerlitz. It's just plain mayhem. Look at that mess. It displays nothing of Napoleon's genius, and is the typical boring, disarrayed fracas that Hollywood always resorts to when they're too inept to choreograph a massive battle. Before the battle, they show Napoleon himself doing reconnaissance, which is just plain stupid. Obviously, he wouldn't do something so foolish. Then they show this. This was not some brilliant routing of an enemy.
We're pinned in! Off the ice!
In reality, he shot a single salvo into a lake that likely killed a couple of soldiers. Nothing special whatsoever. This is dumb and boring. Then there's the Battle of Borodino. It shows this glorious charge into the fight and then cuts before anything happens. Firstly, why such a sad jump right when the action was about to hit? That's just lame. Second, by 1812, Napoleon was in no way leading from the front. In fact, he generally didn't lead cavalry himself. He was an artilleryman, not a cavalryman. It was only at Eylau in 1807 that he had any participation in cavalry, and his part was mostly in the rear. They even show him leading the next and final battle at Waterloo. No, he mostly sat on a chair on a hill overlooking the fighting, taking some power naps when he could, and completely surrounded by his reformulated Imperial Guard. Yet Scott still makes the whole thing degenerate into a free-for-all with Napoleon inside it. Also, Napoleon definitely didn't specifically aim artillery barrages at Wellington. And wow, does the famous charge on infantry squares look boring. Look at the horsies go in a circle, ring around the mulberry bush, whee! Seriously though, show something happening. Like, look at this 1970 movie that obviously didn't have CGI to help multiply their numbers. Now that's how you show the Battle of Waterloo. Go watch that movie if you want a better story about Napoleon. It is surprisingly accurate. That is such a better movie than this pile of crap. And to put a final turd on this shit Sunday, Scott demanded that a sniper with a magnified scope be put in this.
I have the Emperor in my sights. Do I have permission to fire?
Despite all his advisors telling him not to. There had been some attempts at rifle scopes by then, most notably an American inventor during the Revolutionary War. In that case, it almost poked his eye out.
You'll shoot your eye out, kid. Ho, ho, ho.
The first rifle scope, as we know it, didn't come until 1835, 20 years after this battle, and definitely no one shot at Napoleon's hat during the battle. What a stupid thing to include. This movie sucks. Even if I could turn off my historian brain, it would be a mess. The movie did terribly in the box office for that reason. But it is also a massive disservice to one of the most influential people of the modern era, if not the most. The story is all over the place, poorly represents its topic, and even the spectacle falls on its face. How did Scott go so wrong? I don't know. I hope his failure doesn't mean the generally good trend in historical movies is coming to an end, because we had some truly great ones in 2023. Here's hoping this doesn't ruin it for the rest of us. Thanks once again to Ara for sponsoring. Be sure to check out a free 14-day trial by going to ara.com/cynicalhistorian. I have you now. Here. Who's a good boy? Who's a good boy? Thank you. Mwah. I. Meow. 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 If you're gonna meow, you're gonna get picked up. That's the cost. Yes, hi. A good boy. Ooh. Why are you rubbing on the camera? Stop it. You having fun down there? It's making too much noise. Do you have to play with the one that has a bell on it? Really? Where's your boy? Meow. 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 God fucking... It's 11 o'clock at night, and that's when the guns come out, apparently. Ain't Albuquerque grand? In Toulon, Napoleon... I hate French. They're the reason why we can't spell anything in English. Surprised King isn't interrupting. You know your namesake is somebody who literally held more of France than the French king at the time, right? You should be angry about Napoleon. And pre-planning a pincer formation. There's too much to talk about it. Especially when Last Duel was so cool. Meow. Meow.